Okay, now it's my turn to cover the story of Rebecca. The book of Genesis, chapter 24, and verse 2. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. At verse 3, And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. At verse 4, But thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. At verse 5, And the servant said unto him, Peradventure the woman will not be willing to follow me unto this land. Must I needs bring thy son again unto the land from whence thou camest? At verse 6, And Abraham said unto him, Beware thou that thou bring not my son thither again. At verse 8, And if the woman will not be willing to follow thee, then thou shalt be clear from this my oath, only bring not my son thither again. At verse 10, And the servant took 10 camels of the camels of his master, and departed. For all the goods of his master were in his hand. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia unto the city of Nahor. The book of Genesis, chapter 24, at verse 21. And the man wondering at her held his peace, to wit whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. At verse 22, And it came to pass, as the camels had done drinking, that the man took the golden earring of half a shekel weight, and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight of gold. At verse 30, And it came to pass, when he saw the earring and bracelets upon his sister's hands, and when he heard the words of Rebekah his sister, saying, Thus spake the man unto me, that he came unto the man, and behold, he stood by the camels at the well. At verse 47, And I asked her, and said, Whose daughter art thou? And she said, The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bare unto him. And I put the earring upon her face, and the bracelets upon her hands. At verse 53, And the servant brought forth jewels of silver, and jewels of gold, and raiment, and gave them to Rebekah. He gave also to her brother and to her mother precious things. The first thing that you need to pay attention to is the fact that Rebekah comes from the exact same identical place that God called Abraham out of. The second thing that you need to pay attention to is the fact that Abraham left a loophole and said if the woman is not willing to follow, that the servant would be clear from the oath. Due to the fact that Abraham knows his own people and how they operate and the things that appealed to them, he taught and trained his servant on what to do as he explained the oath. Now the servant was concerned about getting this right because he didn't want to fail Abraham, because he knew exactly how important this was that the bloodline be maintained. Now the servant comes up to bat, and there are several key words that we need to clearly pay attention to so that we don't misunderstand the context of this chapter. At verse 21, the key word in this verse leading up to the transaction is prosperous. If you look at the description of this verse, you should be able to pick up on the fact that the servant was nervous. He didn't want to come all this way and then fail. At verse 22, The key phrases in this particular verse are as follows: half a shekel weight, and 10 shekels weight of gold. For those in support of wearing makeup and jewelry only see these key words while disregarding the key words and key phrases that I just mentioned. And those key words are earring and 2 bracelets. The book of scriptures was first printed at the Gutenberg press in the year 1440. The United States of America was just barely being settled in the 1700s. So if you look at the book of scriptures and you were born in the United States and you are alive today, you have to completely and utterly disregard the American way of thinking, as America is in trouble for its ungodly wickedness. Just because time, culture, and technology changes doesn't mean that God changes with it. See, if you were a part of God's people in the Old Covenant, you had to conform to God's ways through the process that God established. Same for the New Testament. Now, we have additional tools such as concordances, encyclopedias, and other means of books that define the meaning of words. And languages, of course, does migrate and change. And in some cases, it has changed over time. However, when it comes to context and God's intentions, when it comes to topics such as wearing makeup and jewelry, you only have 2 sides: those who are for it and those who are against it. Those for it failed to study this topic all the way out in full. Why? Because they like their makeup and their jewelry. It means more to them than even the smallest of details outlined in scripture. And that is why I exclusively say it's not okay for men and women who believe the scriptures to wear makeup and jewelry. In the times that Abraham lived in, during the frame of time that Isaac came up in, the custom when you wanted a wife was you had to buy her or pay a price set by the father of that daughter. If you didn't have enough money to satisfy the greed factor of her father, there was only one other way. You only had one other option to get her hand in marriage, and that is you had to work for her. And that workload and tenure was again indeed set by her father. But before all of that was even considered, the potential wife had to give consent. I say all that to say this: the earring and the bracelets were a form of financial currency signifying the wealth and prestige that came from the substance that God blessed Abraham with. This was not a fashion statement at all. This was not a fashion statement whatsoever. We are going to go through all the verses and grab all the details that my opponents who support the wearing of makeup and jewelry either didn't see, don't know, overlooked, and more than likely ignored and disregarded altogether. I studied this twice just to make sure that I was not crazy. The second time I studied this, I scrapped the pages of notes that I had and started over fresh from the top and from the beginning. The Old Testament books of scripture were written in the Hebrew and translated into English. The Hebrew vocabulary bank is a rather small one. Some words had to be added and were added in order for us to have a chance at being able to understand it. And the translators were very careful to note it. The book of Genesis, chapter 24 at verse 21, The key word in this verse is prosperous. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew means to push forward, to break out, to go over, to be good, to be neat, to be profitable. It meant prosperity. It meant prosperous. It meant prosperously. At verse 22, the first key word in this verse is golden. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant to shimmer. It means gold. It means something gold colored. It meant yellow. It meant as oil. It meant a clear sky. It meant fair weather. The second key word in this verse is earring. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant nose ring. It meant jewel. The third key word in this verse is shekel. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant weight. It meant coin. The fourth key word in this verse is weight. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant numerically estimated. It meant full. The fifth key word in this verse is bracelets. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant arm clasp, a lid, a covering. The sixth key word in this verse is shekels. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant a weight used as a commercial, a standard. At verse 35, the first key word in this verse is blessed. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant to kneel by implication to bless, to congratulate, to praise, to salute, to thank. The second key word in this verse is silver. The scripture-based definition from the Hebrew meant money. It meant price. At verse 53, the first key word in this verse is jewels. The scripture-based definitions from the Hebrew meant something prepared. It meant utensil. It meant dress. It meant weapon. It meant armor. It meant artillery. It meant bag. It meant carriage. It meant furnish. It meant furniture. It meant instrument. It meant pot. It meant psaltery. It meant sack. It meant stuff. It meant thing. It meant tool. The second key word in this verse is raiment. The scripture-based definitions from the Hebrew meant a covering. It meant clothing. It meant apparel. It meant garment. It meant lap. It meant rag. It meant robe. It meant vesture. It meant wardrobe. The third key word in this verse is precious. The scripture-based definitions from the Hebrew meant a gem. It meant a present. A few bonus scripture-based definitions according to the book of Genesis, chapter 3, at verse number 21. The first key word is coats. The scripture-based definition meant to cover. It meant a shirt. It meant a garment. It meant a robe. It meant a cloak. The second key word in this verse is skins. The scripture-based definitions meant hide. It meant leather. The third key word in this verse is clothe. The scripture-based definitions meant to wrap around. It meant to put on a garment. It meant apparel. It meant arm array. It meant come upon. It meant wear. When God clothed Adam and Eve, he fully clothed them in two separate sets of clothing that was specifically designed for the male, which was Adam, and clothing for the female, which was Eve. He covered their flesh because the covering that Adam and Eve made for themselves was not adequate enough to cover everything that needed to be covered. Or otherwise, God would have just left theirs alone and ran with that. I don't care if you are a man or a woman. Showing off your flesh goes against the very reason why God fully clothed Adam and Eve in the first place. I had to deal with the clothing portion here to do my dead level best to paint the picture of what God deemed appropriate so that we can adequately deal with the specific details of the jewelry presented to Rebecca, so that people will stop using it to justify the wearing of jewelry while on the subject of it being okay for scripture-believing men and women to wear makeup and jewelry. Starting with the earring. In the Hebrew, the scripture-based definition in singular form is a nose ring or a jewel. This is what the American-based definition of an earring looks like. If we're going to use Rebecca's story as a means of justifying the wearing of an earring, then at the very least, get that part right and get a nose jewel. The next thing that we're going to deal with is the bracelets. The scripture-based definitions meant an arm clasp. It means a lid. It means a covering. If we remain consistent with God's method and God's concepts of a covering, the flesh is going to be covered up. If you listen carefully to the scripture-based definitions, you shouldn't draw any conclusions other than the fact that this jewelry represents wealth and currency. And this has absolutely nothing to do with a fashion statement. None of the scripture-based definitions support any concept related to fashion whatsoever. This is what the American-based definition of a bracelet looks like. The scripture-based definition of the word bracelet is something that goes on your hands, not your wrist. Don't forget that the bracelets were 10 shekels weight of gold, which represented money, not fashion. How do we know this? At verse 30, he saw the earring and the bracelets upon his sister's hands, not her wrist. At verse 47, the earring was on the face, not on the ear according to American standards. And the bracelets were upon her hands, not on or around her wrist. If we take this logic and apply verse 53 properly, according to as it is written here, to today's time or American culture, the man would have to give the earring, the bracelets, the jewels of gold, and raiment to the wife, the brother, and her mother. So here's the question. Solely based on what we just discussed, from the book of Genesis, chapter 24. Don't go anywhere else in Scripture. Stay right here, okay? Don't answer from another place of Scripture because we haven't gone anywhere else. The only thing that we did was we went back over an area or territory that we already covered. So answer the question from this particular setting of Scripture. Is it okay for men and women who believe the Scriptures to wear makeup and jewelry from what we just discussed? Leave in the comments which one of the 10 things that you needed to pay attention to in order to help you follow along.